short lesson, I'm going to talk about sight reading. This will be a part of a series of, I guess, lessons on sight reading. I was recently asked by a friend to do some material on this, so I figured that there are probably a lot of guitarists out there who want to improve their sight reading, and I'm one of them as well. I'm constantly striving to find materials and methods to become a faster sight reader, because guitarists are a little bit notorious for being sometimes sloppy sight readers compared to other instrumentalists. And I don't think we have the excuse. I know we do have that kind of weird layout of the fretboard, but I think we can get beyond that if we find the right material. So I'm going to talk about music as a language, and specifically what I call alphabet and grammar. This is for today's lesson. So since music is a language, it does help to know the alphabet, the grammar, and the vocabulary, which will be part of the next lesson. I'll talk about the vocabulary. If you try to read a foreign language without knowing those three things, alphabet, grammar, and vocabulary, it can be very difficult to do that, to read a foreign language. And music is really a language, so if we don't know those building blocks, then it's very tough to read music quickly, to sight read. It would be like trying to read letter by letter. And I mean, if you didn't know the alphabet, I don't even know. I guess sight reading, for a lot of people, they probably hear the piece first and then attempt to read through the piece. And that's not really true sight reading. I think true sight reading is when you are reading something that you don't know by ear. So if you wish to improve sight reading, I think you need to practice some of these basic building blocks, the alphabet, the grammar, and the vocabulary each day, just for a little bit of time. Ideally, you should be fluent at these, just like when you recite the alphabet, for example. So I'm going to play an example by Ferdinand Carulli. It's a pretty short example. It's in C major and it's mostly in the open position. So I'm going to play it and then I'm going to talk about the alphabet and the grammar behind this example. Okay, so I've chosen this example. I think it's not very well known. It's a 19th century piece, and I'm going to be talking about some materials drawn from 19th century method books. So it's a fun little piece there. So the first thing I want to talk about is the alphabet. So these are things like triads and scales, chords and scales, for example. So if I play the first two measures, for example, we already see quite a number of triads here. So a triad is three different notes stacked in thirds. So C, E, G, for example, is a triad there. And so I've created a document which is just 3 pages, and it has that musical example and then some things where you can practice, some things to practice that are related to the musical example and the building blocks behind the musical example. So the musical example starts. With a couple of different fingerings. If you stack those notes together, there you have a triad: G, C, E, and G. So if you practice triads, you actually have the building blocks behind that opening pickup there. The next few beats are triads again, but now they're stacked together. So if you practice triads now in the open position, which is on page 2, arrows pointing to the example, so you see specifically what triad goes to what part of the piece. So there we have that triad there. So we have, just in those two measures, we have, it's filled with C major triads. The third measure, we have a scale, but I'm going to talk about that later. No, I'm going to talk about that now. We have a scale. So I'll play it from the start. Triad, 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 now scale. So notice that this is a C major scale. Couple of little chromatic inflections, a G sharp and a C sharp. Essentially it's a C major scale. So it's really valuable to practice scales in positions. So this is a C major scale in open position or in first position. Guitarists tend to practice scales in a kind of Segovia-like fashion, which is I think he intended those to be a really good technical exercise, whereas scales from the 19th century were really intended to be sort of exercise in fretboard harmony. So they would often have scales in different positions: C major in first position, C major in fifth position, C major in seventh position, for example. So this is in open position. The next thing I want to talk about is relating to scales again, this time scales in harmony. So in measures 9 to 10 of this example, we have in the bottom two voices, we have a line that's moving in thirds like that. There's an E on the top of that. It's a very common texture. Texture in a lot of guitar music, but the point of this is that if we practice scales not only just in positions but also in different harmonies, so in thirds, for example, if we practice the A minor scale in thirds, so this is an A minor fragment of a scale, so in a melodic minor there you have the F sharp raised 6th and the G sharp the raised 7th. So if we do this in thirds, and right there, excuse me, right there we have directly comprising the musical example. It's the building block behind this musical example. And then there is there's a sequence of this down a step. So the first phrase was in A minor, so down a step is in G major. So once again we have a scale in thirds in the bottom two voices. And once again, if we practice the G major scale in thirds, that's right there. So pianists and I think even violinists tend to practice scales in thirds and other intervals very frequently. It's just a sort of part of their practice. And I think guitarists could really benefit from it because triads and scales in thirds are among the most common building blocks of music that we find in pieces of music. So it's very worthwhile to practice these so that when you see them in a piece of music that you haven't seen before, you can identify and your fingers know exactly where to do those notes, where to play those notes. So that's the alphabet, triads and scales. So now I want to talk about the grammar. So grammar is things like cadences and modulations. So we have a couple of cadences. There's one in measures 7 to 8, which is in C major. So I've taken a cadence formula from Chies's Fundamental Technique, a great series of books. So if we play those last three chords there, and now we play the musical example, it's very basically the same chords there. So we have another cadence in G, measures 3 to 4. Now I'll play the cadence that's in the document I made. So if I play the last 4 chords of that cadence progression, and now I play the musical example. Very, very similar there to one another. So again, cadences, they happen in all tonal music. They're a way to begin and end phrases and also modulate. Composers often, for example, that cadence in G is used as a way to sort of quickly modulate to G. So they appear in pretty much any tonal piece of music. You'll find some kind of cadence. So it's really handy to practice the basic cadence formulas. So that's on page 3. I have a C major and a G major cadence that are very directly related to the musical examples. Finally, I'm going to talk about modulations. So this is definitely something that guitarists don't practice much, and this is something that I've found only fairly recently with my new passion for 19th century method books. I found a great exercise for modulations in Horetsky's Preludes, Cadences, and Modulations. So this piece has a lot of what we call tonicization, which is where the piece modulates very briefly and then returns to the key that it was originally in. So we're in C major, but there are 3, there might be more, but there are 3 examples that I've given here, examples of tonicization. The first one is in G, so we go from C to G and then immediately back to C. G is probably the most expected key because it's the dominant of C, the 5th key above C, C, D, E, F, G. So we usually expect to move to the dominant at some point. So I'll play the first 4 measures. So we're in C major, triads, scale. So we've just tonicized G there. Now the way to, there's sort of a clue that you can use, is whenever you see an accidental, chances are that that accidental is pointing you towards something. It's pointing you to the next key. So in that example there, in the cadence, we have an F sharp, which is not part of C major. So that F sharp is what we call a leading tone of G major. So it has a pull that wants to go up a half step. So that's really strongly suggesting G major. If you see, for example, a C sharp, that will probably want to go to a D, some kind of D. So you'll have like an A7 chord going to a D chord, for example. If you see an E sharp, if you see a D sharp, that's probably wanting to go to E. So you have a B7 to an E chord. So that's a little trick you can use. Whenever you see an accidental, this is not 100% of the time, but it's most of the time, like 3/4 of the time, that accidental will be the leading tone to the new key. And that's going to be important for the next example as well. But I want to go, so this exercise in modulation in G major, so going from C major to G major, Horetsky has laid out the most straightforward way to get from C major to G major. That's his exercise there. So we're starting in C, go to A minor, D7, G. And that's basically what happens here. And so the second example measures 6 to 7. We're in C again, but now we're going to very briefly tonicize a D minor chord. So again, you see the C sharp leading tone going to D, so C sharp going to D. And the exercise that Horetsky has for going from C major to D minor. We have a very similar chord progression there. And finally, towards the end of the piece, measures 25 to 26, we have another very brief tonicization, this time tonicization of F major. So C is the dominant of F. If you think of the circle of fifths, C is in the middle, G is to the right, and F is to the left. So this time we have a B flat. So the thing with flats usually want to go down. So B flat will want to go to an A. So we're using a C7 chord. That's a very common chord shape going to this F. So if we look at the modulation exercise, that's indeed what Horetsky has given as well, using a C7 to go to F. So that's some of the grammar, cadences, and modulation. I've talked about the alphabet, things like triads and scales. So the next video I will talk about the vocabulary, which are things like chord progressions, sequences, and arpeggios, and I'll use different musical examples for that. if I have one thing that you can take away from this video, it's that when you read music, you should be able to identify everything in the music. Every single chord and note has a function, and if we know the function of everything, and we know what those building blocks are on the guitar, then we will be able to sight read with a lot more speed and accuracy and fluency. If we don't know the function of the notes, and we don't know the building blocks, we'll probably be reading note by note, and that's very, very slow. You'll save a lot of time by actually practicing things like triads, scales and positions, cadences and modulations, because they appear many, many times in different pieces. They're basically like, you can think of it like a chess move, for example. You know, a great chess player has a kind of bank of moves, long-range moves, whereas kind of amateur chess players like me play move by move. You know, oh, I'm going to move here next. I'm going to move here next. It's very similar to that. That would be the equivalent of reading one note at a time and finding it on the instrument. This helps us to see the words and the sentences of music rather than the individual notes. So stay tuned for part 2, which will be on the vocabulary.